It was a time of marvels, powerful railroads, mighty bridges, giant factories, telegraphs, telephones, and newspapers for a penny that linked and shrank the world. And towering above them were the cities, symbols of an age. The Industrial Revolution, this time on the Western tradition.
And now UCLA professor Eugene Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
In 1848, a young Prussian exile living in Brussels wrote this hymn to the bourgeoisie. It has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It has created more massive and colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing whole continents for cultivation, making rivers navigable, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century could have told that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? The passage is from the Communist Manifesto, and its writer, of course, was Karl Marx, who was very impressed by material things. And when Marx wrote this, he wrote it together with his friend Friedrich Engels, who was quieter and less dramatic, hence more liable to be forgotten than Marx. So when Marx and Engels wrote this, the 19th century was just beginning to reveal its prodigies that we usually lump together as the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is usually related to advances in textile production after it became mechanized in 18th century England. But the machinery still turned with water power. In 1848, when the Communist Manifesto came out, most of the textile works on the continent were still dependent on the streams that made them run. Even in England, which was the great pioneer of Industrial Revolution, 1 mill in 5 had no steam engine. But the effect on people's lives and on society as a whole was already dramatic. In a later show, I shall be talking about the dark side of the Industrial Revolution, the misery and suffering it brought to millions. Just after 1800, for example, William Blake, the visionary English poet who was the son of a London hosier, attacked the dark, satanic mills that defiled England's green and pleasant land. But within a generation of Blake's poem, these dark, satanic workshops were also turning out ginghams and calicos and other stuff that even working women could afford to buy. So now, poor girls who had turned out for centuries dressed in drab homespun began to look, as a Frenchman was going to put it in the late 40s, like a garden full of flowers. And it wasn't just the girls. For thousands of years, poor people had worn second-hand clothes, hand-me-downs, hard, durable stuff of which they would have one suit or one dress in a lifetime, at most two. In the 19th century, however, they were going to be offered ready-mades at accessible prices, garments sewn on the new mechanical sewing machines that a New Yorker, Isaac Singer, patented in 1851. And by the end of the century, they might be able to buy their own sewing machine and make their own garments and those of their family, no longer by needle and thread, but by stitching them mechanically in a fraction of the time. So Marx wasn't alone in feeling the revolutionary character and the results and the potential of industrialism, industrialism itself being a word coined in the 1820s. And he wasn't the only one to take present achievements as indications of future growth. He was right to be impressed, and he was right to expect more of the future. There were only about 16,000 miles of railroad track in Europe when Marx published his Communist Manifesto. But if you put them together with the tunnels, the railway bridges, the stations and workshops and sheds that were part of the system, they already represented more stone and metal than all the monuments of antiquity, including the pyramids. By the First World War, there would be over 220,000 miles of rail running across Europe, and if you count the subways and the drains and the sewers that made the cities work, the aqueducts, as great as anything the Romans built, the thousands of miles of road and canal and tunnel, and bridges grander and more imaginative than any ever built before, and the tens of thousands of miles of telegraph line, not to mention the poles that lined the landscape in a completely new way. If you count all this, you have a mass of public works vaster than anything humanity ever produced. One English historian reckons that the 19th century also produced more stonework in the Gothic style than the Middle Ages. It certainly produced more classical buildings than the Classical Age ever did. But the greatest advances of the Industrial Revolution were in the realm of transport and communications. When the 19th century opened, Napoleon's armies didn't move much faster than those of Julius Caesar. When the century closed, you could cross all of Europe in 3 or 4 days by rail, and everybody knew you could go around the world in 80 days, as Phineas Fogg had done in Jules Verne's novel of 1873. And you could do all this in the new comfort of railway cars, dining cars, even sleeping cars. There were other extraordinary changes as well. For the first time, news was consistently moving faster than people. In ancient times, you could send a message by carrier pigeon, and you could hope that the pigeon didn't get diverted along the way or eaten. In the time of the Three Musketeers, you could send a message by courier who might cover as much as 60 miles a day, as long as he wasn't held up by bad weather or by robbers. By the time of the French Revolution, you could send a message by semaphore telegraph, provided the message was simple and the weather was clear. But by the 1870s, a telegram could reach around the world in a few hours, and by 1900, radio messages could leap over the oceans in a flash. The telephone, which people took for a trick in the 1870s, had 2.5 million European subscribers by 1900. and rotary presses were turning out daily and weekly papers in increasing numbers, making news increasingly available. Even news itself was a 19th century notion, suggesting a world attuned to novelty rather than routine. Daily newspapers existed in the 18th century, but they cost a lot of money, and practically speaking, they were reserved for the well-off. It wasn't until the introduction of the rotary press in the mid-19th century that all this changed. The London Times, for example, printed 5,000 copies a day in 1815 and sold them for 7 pence. 40 years later, it sold 50,000 copies a day at 5 pence. In 1815, it took 4 days before the Battle of Waterloo was reported in London. But after 1851, when an underwater cable linked Dover to Calais, and after 1866, when it linked England to America, news took only a matter of hours. And there were also newspapers selling for a penny only, which made news available to all and raised circulation first into the hundreds of thousands, eventually by the 90s, the 1890s, into the millions. The influence and the power of the press was a completely unexpected phenomenon. It was in 1828 that an article in a Scottish magazine declared that the gallery where reporters sat listening to parliamentary debates had become a fourth estate of the realm. So now, what today we call the media were added to the old regime vocabulary of clergy, nobles, and third estate. Now here was a completely new way of addressing the people, of affecting the masses, and it proved so effective that a number of revolutions, like the Revolution of 1830, and a number of major political crises, like the Dreyfus affair in France in the 1890s, could be directly attributed to the press, which first whipped up public concern and inflamed it, then claimed to reflect what it had in fact created. Mass circulation papers, where the real profits are, were sold by sensationalism and muckraking. So that's what a lot of papers looked for, and their revelations could shake governments as well as individuals. They could bankrupt a bank, they could topple a government, they could help to start a war, which happened when the French press whipped up popular feeling against the Prussians in 1870, or the Hearst press helped to start the Spanish-American War in 1898.
But apart from these spectacular effects, the simple fact that newspapers brought a mass of world news to the door each morning, news selected chiefly for its lurid appeal, this made the world seem a busy, crowded place full mostly of crisis and crime. Of course, there's crime in every society, there's violence in every age, and our age is no more criminal, no more violent or corrupt than others, though you might not believe it. If anything, our age is less so. But we know more about exceptional activities because ordinary activities are not news. There is no story in a wife loving her husband or a father loving his children. It's only when they beat each other that it becomes interesting, and this is what is news. So we know more about these activities. We read and hear all the time about things that traditional societies knew about only if they happened next door or if they were sufficiently spectacular. So what was ignored until the 1800s and what remained vague or diffuse until then became increasingly real and personalized thereafter. It became even more real when you could see a picture of it. In the 19th century, it wasn't just newsprint that became affordable and accessible, pictures did too. The lithographic process developed after 1798, photography developed after 1839, and then photolithography started a tide of prints and etchings that produced graphic, visible witness of wonders and horrors, horrors like Goya's Horrors of War series, that came home more forcefully when you could see them. They also allowed people of modest means to put pictures on the wall or on the mantelpiece, portraits, caricatures, reproductions of art, and this filled humble homes with color. It gave shape and concreteness to news events. It put a face on public figures that most people had never seen before. And it also allowed lovers or relatives to send each other their likeness or a picture postcard from faraway places. And what all this did was to accentuate the chief characteristic of the age, which was novelty and constant change. All ages see change. All ages are times of transition. Eve probably told Adam that they lived in a time of transition. But the 19th century brought this home more forcefully than any age had before, and the news industry documented, illustrated the process, so you couldn't escape from it. All these achievements were spectacular, but they also affected people's lives in unspectacular ways. The communications revolution was as perceptible as the textile revolution. Ordinary people could send telegrams now. They could walk into a post office and send a money order safely. They could afford to buy a stamp and send a letter or a postal package. And ordinary people could take a train, where half a century before they would have walked, or else stayed home. In 1830, less than 20,000 people a year crossed the Atlantic to America. By the 1850s, there were faster clipper ships that could reach Boston from Liverpool in only 12 days. And then came steamships, which were a lot more reliable, until by the end of the century, 1 million people crossed the Atlantic every year. The agricultural revolution was less spectacular, but then you could not have had an industrial revolution without it. In the age of industrialization, the greatest industry was still agriculture, and agriculture was revolutionized, so that eventually fewer men and women were able to feed a lot more people. In 1800, 3/4 of the population of Europe were engaged in growing food. More than 3/4 of the food of ordinary people consisted of potatoes and bread. By 1900, only half the population of Europe was growing food, and Europeans were eating more vegetables, more meat, more fruit than ever before. But it was a long haul.
Through all of recorded history until just the other day, Europe had lived on the verge of famine, or at least on the verge of hunger, as many people still do in non-industrialized nations. You can't control the weather. You can't control the harvests until the 19th century. Until that time, food shortages were par for the course. Famine was part of the experience of every generation in Europe. And famine didn't mean missing a meal. It meant people eating grass, or earth, or tree bark, or sometimes their own hands, or falling dead in the streets or in country ditches.
Although scenes like this one had become rare in Europe by 1800, there were several serious famines in the years just after the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, in the early 30s, and most dramatically in the late 1840s, when famine cut Ireland's population by 20%. After the mid-19th century, Western Europe would never know such peacetime catastrophes again. This was partly because ships and rail could now move grain faster and more efficiently to where it was needed, and partly because farmers had learned how to produce larger surpluses. And Europe needed ever larger surpluses because more people lived in cities and fewer people worked the land. In 1800, about 10% of Europeans lived in cities. By 1900, about 40% of them lived there, and someone had to feed them. Some of the surplus food came from outside Europe, from North America, from South America, from Australia, which, remember, were still, in terms of economics and population, extensions of Europe. By the end of the 19th century, about 1/10 of international trade was in cereals. King corn was overtaking King cotton. But most of the extra food was produced in Europe itself, a lot of it in the most advanced industrial countries. In fact, it was Britain's agricultural revolution of the 18th century that led to the Industrial Revolution of the 19th. Industrialized Britain produced more food and fed its exploited masses better than Russia, which was totally agricultural. This was achieved by putting more land under the plow, by rationalizing production, by using better crop rotation, by using more fertilizer, and by using better tools. First, the scythe instead of the sickle. In due course, machinery like harvesters and threshers. By 1914, 2.5 times as many people lived in Europe as a century before, and they were better fed by a vastly smaller proportion of the population. Of course, more land under the plow also meant that agriculture probably ruined more of the environment than industry did, cutting down forests, affecting the water tables all over Europe. If you set this aside, the agricultural revolution brought a new prosperity to all the land. By the end of the 19th century, there were fewer peasants, there were more farmers. There were fewer people living on the land, but those who made their living from the land farmed better and lived better. They had better homes, they had more and better furniture. They could afford to show off their regional costumes, which were less historical revivals than modern status symbols. And they could go to the market or to the fair on better roads. But the most dramatic changes took place not in the country, but in town. There, the novelty lay in the appearance of the industrial city, and especially the big city. In 1800, there were 17 cities in Europe with a population over 100,000 people. By 1900, there were 100 such cities. 31 million people lived in them, and a lot more passed through, sometimes just to see them. In 1850, tourists went to Manchester or Liverpool the way we go to see Disneyland today, or Hiroshima, because they were extraordinary, fascinating, or terrifying examples of the possibilities of the age, of our dreams, of our nightmares. Cities, of course, are the home of civilization. From the ancient world, they have been so. And even the word civilization proves it. Civic, civil,
civility, civilization. They all refer to what a citizen is or should be, the member of an urban community. And an urbanite is described as urbane, courteous, elegant, refined. Few were so really, few are so now. But the urbanites are by definition superior to the rustic countrymen who get all the negative descriptions: boor, yokel, bumpkin, clodhopper, and so on and so on. As I said, this was always so, but in the modern world, in the world made and remade by the Industrial Revolution, it was more so, with profound implications for all of us, as we shall see in our next program.